I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my addicting co-host, Brett.
There you go, Alice. I was sitting here wondering, what is she going to say? And then you come through, as always. And it's true. People just can't quit me. That's all there is to it.
It's not about you, Brett. As usual, it's not about you. And here's why it's not about you. Today, we have an amazing guest with us. You guys are going to love this episode because you're going to have some reading to do after this episode. We have with us investigative journalist Philip Isle, and he is here to talk about an incredible new book he has out. It's called Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer. Philip, thank you so much for being here. When I was a prosecutor, prosecuting pill mill doctors was, if you could have a specialty, was my specialty. And it was one of the saddest types of investigations I could undertake, but most meaningful. And you turned more than a decade-long investigation into this incredible book. Thank you for being with us today, Philip.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I didn't realize that you had so much experience with this topic, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
Oh, it's not about me. It's actually about this particular doctor that you write about. So, usually when we think about doctors, we don't think about true crime, but I always introduce Brett with an adjective. And I do not make light of what we're about to talk about when I say addicting, because one of the things about these pill mill doctors and what you delve into in terms of how someone becomes this, how someone who has such an incredible professional background, who has so many academic and professional accolades, can fall so deep into fueling the opioid crisis and really feeding on the addictions of people, which is an illness. So with that, before we dive in, can you give us just a little bit of a background as to, your journalistic background and why this particular book?
Sure. So I'm speaking to you now from my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. I still live about a mile away from my parents where I grew up. And you'll see the connection, how I got involved in a story that involves Chicago and Southern Ohio in a moment. And I'm speaking to you now, I'm 39 years old, and I started this project when I was in my mid-20s. I did not expect for it to take 15 years. If I had known it would take 15 years, I'm not sure I would have signed up. But I didn't know. What happened was, if we can turn back the clock to 2009, I was a couple years out of college. I had just kind of realized that my life's calling was nonfiction writing. I'd been an English major in college, but hadn't figured out that I wanted to be a journalist until I spent about a year in kind of an underwhelming office job in New York City. So I'm fresh off my first newspaper internship. I had written a few short articles. One of the books that had inspired me to be a nonfiction writer was Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, obviously the legendary book that really kicked off the genre in some ways. That was one of the books that had made me want to do this. And I had actually recently applied to a graduate writing program in New York City, one that I would go on to attend, an MFA program. And I had applied to this program with a portfolio of some of the things I had written. But after I'd been accepted, just by pure coincidence, I learned about this kind of long lost college and medical school classmate of my dad's. Now, you guys have perhaps seen the physical copy of the book. In it, there is a photo insert where I include some photos of my dad and Paul Volkmann, both in college at the University of Rochester and in medical school at the University of Chicago. In the Rochester photo, they almost kind of eerily look alike. They were both these kind of bright, nerdy guys from the East Coast who became friends in their undergrad at the University of Rochester, went on by coincidence to go to the same med school program, and then lost touch. And the next thing my dad learned was in the late 2000s, he learned about Paul's involvement in a criminal case. He was under federal indictment at the time. I explained the details of this in the book. Paul reached out to my dad when his wife passed away, asked if my parents would go to the funeral. They didn't know much about what had happened to the guy. In any case, my dad eventually tells me about this. And my dad, for context, is a exceedingly polite, nerdy, law-abiding guy. He sings in civic choirs. He plays golf. He reads books. He's not the kind of person I know to hang out with folks who are charged with essentially being drug-dealing kingpins. But that's what happened here. And so I, the young, ambitious journalist, immediately said, I'm interested in this. I want to see what happened here. I had visions of writing my own in cold blood type story. Now, it turns out I was nowhere near prepared as a person, as a journalist, as a writer to pull it off. But, 23, 24-year-old me wasn't about to hit the brakes. To make a long story short, I dove into the story. There were lots of twists and turns and detours along the way. I kind of made a name for myself as a journalist. This project was on the front burner, then off the front burner. And 15 years later, last year, the book finally came out.
I like how clean cut everybody was in Rochester. And then they go to Chicago and it's like the facial hair comes out,
and one thing I would just add to that is Paul Volkman, the guy at the center of this book, was not somebody I had ever heard of when my dad mentioned his case. He was not somebody who hung out at our house. We didn't go on family vacations together. It was the first I had heard of him. And when I first learned about the story, I knew basically two facts that were separated by 30 years. I knew that Paul and my dad had graduated from the University of Chicago with an MD and a PhD, extraordinarily high level of education. And I knew that 30 years later, Paul had been indicted by federal prosecutors and arrested at his apartment on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And it was the mystery of what happened to this guy in between those two extraordinary facts that really drew me in.
And that's exactly what I was about to say, because that's the thing when you start the book. And I think we all have stereotypes of criminals, whoever they are, whatever they're doing. Pick your crime, you have a stereotype of what that person's going to look like. And I think when you think about doctors who are involved in pill mills, you think, somebody who probably didn't even, got their degree from like the University of the Caribbean or something, or like some mail-in school, or had to go to Mexico City because they couldn't get into any American schools, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a guy who, as you said, he goes to Chicago, one of the finest schools in the country. He's not just a MD, he's a PhD. And the fact that he had the credentials to be an incredible, successful, memorable doctor who really made his mark. And yet that moment happens where he goes from that, and it's several moments, but there's one in particular where everything kind of falls apart. As fascinating as the story of what he does is, the story of how he gets there is mind-blowing.
Yeah, he was a high school valedictorian. Not only did he and my dad go to this MD PhD program, this was a federally funded program. So the federal government, and it has since grown. There are now numerous locations for the MSTP, Medical Scientist Training Program, MD PhD programs around the country that are federally funded. So I was always fascinated by the kind of dark symmetry of the fact that the federal government had paid for this guy to be educated, and albeit a different part of the federal government, had 30 years later come and investigated him, indicted, and ultimately convicted him. And now he's in federal prison.
So before we delve into that 30-year gap of what happened, I think it's an existential question, but also a criminal question. But before we get there, under that indictment, we're not just talking about him writing some friend's prescriptions without properly documenting it. Can you lay out what we're talking about? This just stuck with me. Obviously, now, several years removed from this, know that there is an opioid crisis in this country. But around the time he was really getting into his pill mill conspiracy, it was just the beginning. People didn't quite know where this would lead 10 years, 20 years down the line. And at one point, we had different agencies that track prescribers of narcotics. And at one point, he was the highest prescriber of oxycodone. Is that right?
Yeah.
Please tell us let's fast forward to what we're dealing with. We're not just talking about some guy who writes a couple bad scripts, right?
Correct. And there are numerous extraordinary facts about this case. One extraordinary fact is that his crimes took place in southern Ohio in a town called Portsmouth, which is right on the Ohio River, right on the Ohio-Kentucky border in the Appalachian part of Ohio. And Portsmouth is 400 miles from Chicago, where Paul maintained a residence throughout his period of criminal activity.
A very nice residence.
Yes, he would commute. So he would fly to Columbus on early Monday morning and drive 2 hours south down to Portsmouth. And then he would stay in Portsmouth for the week, and he would return back to Lakeshore Drive in Chicago on the weekends. So that's one unusual fact. If listeners want a sense of this, when we're done, go and pick a spot 400 miles from where you live and imagine that that's where you're spending your work week and coming back. Far away. This, as you said, was not just a few scripts, Alice. This was a period of criminal activity that lasted nearly 3 years. He starts working at these pain clinics, these cash-only, non-hospital affiliated pain clinics in April of 2003, and he isn't finally shut down for good with his registration to prescribe controlled substances suspended until February 2006. So I often say this is like the opposite of a hot-blooded crime. This was a sustained period of criminal activity. He had a lot of time to think about what he was doing. And what was he doing? He was prescribing a lot of pills. The clinics, he started out at a place called Tri-State Healthcare, were ostensibly places where people with intractable chronic pain would go. In theory, these clinics presented themselves as a place where if all other interventions, if surgeries and physical therapy and other medications had failed, you would go to these places for the care that really no one else in the medical world could provide. At least that was what they were presenting themselves as. As it turned out, these kind of sketchy, independent, non-hospital affiliated, often owned by non-medical professional clinics were a pattern down in this area, Eastern Kentucky, Southern Ohio. And there was kind of an established business model where they accepted only cash, no third-party payments, and there wasn't really a variety of medical treatments offered. It was pills. And that was what Paul Volkmann did. He mainly wrote scripts for 3 different kinds of medications: opiate painkillers, sedatives like Valium, and muscle relaxers. And he prescribed a lot of meds. Over time, as I talk about in the book, during his criminal proceedings, there were experts or analysts called to talk about the frequency of these combinations, that time and time again, patients received very similar scripts, and they were big scripts of a lot of pills at once. And so this was an area that was a kind of down and out Rust Belt part of Ohio, a really struggling place that already by the time Volkmann arrived had a pretty serious drug and addiction problem. And according to investigators, he really just kind of took a flamethrower to that fire and just prescribed massive amounts of pills. And a lot of patients died from apparent overdoses in the course of that conduct.
And I worked for Rob Portman, who was a senator from Ohio in the sort of early 2010s. And even then, they were still dealing with all of the after effects of this, because that area right where Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia meet, incredibly impoverished, had been places that had been something before and had kind of fallen off. A lot of people in poverty, a lot of people who had already gone through some of the prior drug epidemics, the heroin epidemic and everything else. And then you have this prescription drug thing that happens. And the fact that these 3 states connected there also made it harder to track, because at the time, tracking prescriptions was so poor, and oftentimes it was done by state-based. And so you had people coming from all these different states, and so you couldn't keep track of anything. Just a complete mess. It's fascinating to me. You mentioned, why would you go 400 miles away? Well, it's not a coincidence. That area really was. I mean, it was, I can't think of an example, but if you can think of a place that's been destroyed by like cocaine or something like that, I mean, that was the epicenter of this entire crisis that now we're very familiar with. But in the mid 2000s, we really didn't understand. And there was so much pushback from the American Medical Association. A lot of the physicians took the position of, look, maybe there's a way to deal with this, but it shouldn't be going after doctors because we're just, and I think he has taken this position.
Yeah.
We're just treating pain. If you want to regulate this, feel free, but don't look to us. Don't try and punish us. And he, I know, has hidden behind that as well.
And Brett, I would add, it isn't just that the location near two other states allowed for a lot of doctor shopping by patients and hopping across state lines and eluding or evading the kind of not super sophisticated prescription tracking systems at the time. But also hopping across state lines meant you were dealing with a whole nother state medical board. I talk in the book about how the clinic that Volkman ultimately worked for started across the river in Kentucky and had its fair share of doctors who had run-ins with the Kentucky Bureau of Medical Licensure for various kinds of shenanigans. And there was news reports there. And then for reasons the clinic owner chalks up to kind of convenience, she hopped over the river to Ohio and kind of got a clean slate, even though it was, 5-10 minute drive away. So I think there were a lot of reasons why that, what they call the tri-state area down there, allowed for these kinds of clinics to take root.
Guys, we want to talk about one of our favorite podcasts, a podcast we love so much we have appeared on it multiple times. Silver Linings Handbook with Jason Blair. Jason is a friend of ours, but he's not just that. He is an incredible interviewer, an incredible podcaster, and his episodes will pull something out of you you didn't even know was there. He says that he wants to have conversations that inspire, and he does just that with interesting conversations with interesting people. And the themes that he looks at are not just true crime, though he's got a lot of great true crime episodes as well. He talks about growth, understanding, belonging, compassion, things that are important in true crime and in life.
And you guys, even if you think you've heard something before, Jason is able to bring out things you never thought about. Just check out these recent episodes. He had an interview with Kimberly Loring, the sister of a 20-year-old missing Montana woman, Ashley Loring Heavywriter, and about her search for her sister, finding faith in God and forgiving those who harmed Ashley. You'll have to check out this incredible interview he had about journalists in Minnesota and Iowa who are still advocating for and searching for Jodi Huisentruit, a broadcast journalist who disappeared in 1995. And then there's this interview with a friend of a domestic violence victim who was murdered in 2023 in Minnesota about what friends can do to be non-judgmental and supportive of those who are facing interpersonal abuse. You guys have got to check out this incredible podcast, Silver Linings Handbook. You can get it wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You choose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. And, it's really interesting because typically when we think, and the statutes, the criminal conduct that he's charged under are what we charge drug dealers with. But we typically think of, a drug dealer, you meet them somewhere and there's an exchange of money for the drugs. This is very, very interesting because obviously these controlled substances are Schedule 2, the most restrictive. Schedule 1, there's no medical use, but Schedule 2 are supposed to be the most restrictive. That's why you have to have a legitimate medical reason written by a medical professional to give you a prescription. And so it's interesting because he is writing a prescription. So instead of handing over heroin, he's handing over a piece of paper that then needs to go get filled somewhere. And this, before pill mill doctors were really prosecuted, it was difficult for a lot of people to wrap their heads around the criminal conduct because it looks so different than what you think of meeting someone on a street corner to exchange physical drugs. But while most pill mill doctors do just what I said, hand over prescriptions, Volkman is a whole different type of pill mill kingpin, as you mentioned. He takes that extra step. And what does he do? Because everyone knows it's kind of annoying. We get a prescription from a doctor. Even my 5-year-old son says, why can't we just get the drugs here? We have to go all the way to a pharmacy down the street even, but you usually have to go to a different professional, a pharmacist, to fill that prescription. But what does Volkman do here that makes it compounds his enormous effect on this area that is soon going to be devastated by the opioid crisis?
So it's pretty wild to think about, and this gets back to these extraordinary facts of the case that even after having studied the case for years, I still can't wrap my head around, really. So Ohio at the time, the Board of Pharmacy had a situation where doctors could apply to be on-site dispensers of medications. Now, I think this law was on the books for the sake of rural doctors who wanted to save their patients the convenience of having to schlep from their office to some faraway pharmacy, probably with the idea that they could prescribe. I doubt they had opiates in mind, but something that needed a prescription and dispense it on site.
Like an antibiotic ointment or something.
Exactly. But what happened with Volkman is within months, weeks really, of his arrival down in Southern Ohio in 2003 to begin working at Tri-State Healthcare, pharmacies in the region start to get really uncomfortable with the scripts he's writing. They strike the pharmacists, because a number of them would ultimately testify at the trial, as dangerous amounts of medications, dangerous combinations of medications. They said the patients didn't really appear to be in pain when they walked in to receive these heavy-duty prescriptions. They said the patients kind of came to the pharmacy in waves, that many of them were willing to pay in cash. The local pharmacists were just spooked by these scripts that this doctor was writing, this new doctor in town. And so one by one, the local pharmacy stopped filling his scripts. And these pharmacists, as I said, ultimately would tell this story at his criminal trial. So within a few months of his arrival, Volkman and his clinic owner, Denise, have a problem because their clinic is basically entirely driven by prescription medication, and they don't have pharmacies to fill them. So they...
And just for that crazy fact, like 98% of his visits left with a prescription? Is that right?
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
insane.
He would maintain that they did offer yoga classes, but that was not enough to convince the jury that was, made this all on the level. So basically, as a high volume prescribing pain clinic without pharmacies willing to fill the scripts, Paul and Denise's daughter, who also worked at the clinic, submit an application to the Ohio State Board of Pharmacy for permission to start dispensing on site. And I find that document interesting because it has all of their signatures on it. It's kind of like proof of their cooperation. And they're given the green light, which is kind of remarkable. From the Board of Pharmacy, a guy from the board comes down, explains what the rules are. The rules were supposed to be very, very stringent. They were supposed to keep meticulous eye on the movement of the pills and secure the pills. And Paul Volkman was supposed to sign off and count and basically act as the pharmacist for every pill that went out the door. These were the rules explained to them. It wasn't how it went. But they are ultimately given the green light to open up what is essentially an in-house pharmacy. So very early on in his tenure down there, Tri-State Healthcare becomes a one-stop shop where patients pay cash, see the doctor, get scripts, walk literally down the hall with those scripts to the on-site in-house dispensary, pay more cash. The dispensary did not accept insurance, anything like that, and then walk away with a whole bunch of pills. And that is how the clinic operated for years. And it was a pretty successful business.
And didn't you write that people would have like barbecues and stuff out in the parking lot while they're waiting on their...
So that was, I think, one of Volkman's predecessors.
That was the other guy. Okay.
Where they described the parking lot as looking like a tailgate, with people hanging out, eating sandwiches and so on. The prosecutors for Volkman's case did describe the scene in terms of the crowds as like a Led Zeppelin concert at one point. Or maybe that was a witness at the case. And so you certainly heard about crowds outside of these clinics because word got around that Volkman was a, let's say, liberal prescriber, and it was a popular clinic.
And I know you had the opportunity to interview hundreds of people in writing this book. One of the things about the people who are getting these scripts, because obviously you have to have someone who receives the script to have him be this pill mill dispenser.
Right.
It's really difficult because at least when I prosecuted these types of cases, a lot of these script receivers would be our witnesses. And it's a huge array. There are, of course, people who claim that they'll do whatever a medical professional tells them to do. Heck, I do that, right? I mean, you're the professional. You're telling me what to do. This should be safe. And we'll talk about it later, but obviously it leads to not just one or two people deaths, but possibly dozens of people's deaths. And then you have the people who are truly addicted, which is a problem that a doctor should be helping them with. Instead of helping them with that addiction, he is fueling the addiction. And then third, you have people who are just straight up seeking the pills, whether to dispense themselves or they are seeking it themselves, but there's a huge array, and it is not open and shut in terms of, you just have a guilty doctor and a bunch of innocents or a bunch of people who are willing or not willing. It gets very murky. So having spoken to all these people, I'd love to hear your perspective in terms of, how you face this kind of complex issue where obviously if there's no one to give the script to, he wouldn't be a very successful criminal. But at the same time, many of them are dealing with very serious addiction issues.
Well, you've just put your finger on one of the reasons this book took me 15 years. I mean, in my book talks, I'm often coming back to this refrain of, and that's another reason this took so long, and that's another reason. But I found the issues here so daunting of pain, which is complex and which has its own unique history, the context of which I had to get into for the book, where there was a sea change in the treatment of pain in the 80s and 90s, and then OxyContin rolls around, and you see healthcare facilities talking about the fifth vital sign, where they're asking patients, for what their pain score is, in addition to taking other vital signs when the patient arrives. So there's the pain thing, and also pain is not something you can test for. So that makes it a even more complicated medical phenomenon. Your blood sugar, my dad's an endocrinologist, your pulse, your temperature, these are all things a person can measure, but pain, there isn't a test for it. So that complicates it. Then you get into the addiction side of things, where some of the most powerful medications we have for treating pain, and I always point out, I am not anti-opiate. As a rule, I spoke to a lot of experts who say that opiates are the best, strongest medications we have for treating certain kinds of pain. And they're still, I think, pretty widely regarded as the standard for post-operative care, for instance. So, but you have opiates, these extremely powerful drugs that are also highly addictive. And they also command a really high value on the street when they're sold. So this is all really complicated stuff. And earlier on, you quoted from the Controlled Substances Act, the law Volkman was prosecuted under, and you used the word that was a word I thought about a lot, which is legitimate and illegitimate. Your listeners might not know that in the Controlled Substances Act, there isn't like a number of Vicodin after which it becomes drug dealing. There isn't a number of Valium where, it's 79, it's legal, 80, it's not. It hinges on legitimacy, which means it hinges on expert testimony and interpretation of that highly subjective word, legitimate. So that further complicated it. And so there was just like layers of complexity on top of one another that I felt very daunted by. I, of course, am not an MD or a PhD, so there was that too. So like I rolled into this story as just some 25-year-old kid who was interested in telling the story. And I had to do a lot of homework before I really felt confident in going to print with this. I should add, though, and one of the thing I want to talk about with you guys is to zoom out for a sec. There have been hundreds or at least dozens of doctors charged and convicted with prescription drug dealing during the opiate epidemic. Alice, it sounds like you worked on some of those cases. But the number of defendants who went to trial is, as you well know, far lower. I think the number for doctors is probably a little bit higher because they're a bit more confident and maybe stubborn for who reject plea deals. But Volkman, who is nothing if not stubborn and believes in his own innocence to this day, didn't take a plea deal. So as a result, his case went to a lengthy trial, 8 weeks in 2011 in Cincinnati, where the prosecution called 70 witnesses, the defense called 10 witnesses. I say all this because it was an immense help to me as a journalist to be able to simply go to the facts, to draw from this sworn testimony. The trial transcript is 4,000 pages long. So I had this tremendous resource to draw from in the trial transcript that gave me, I think, a boost of confidence in being able to write about this because I could get into the specifics of this case.
I thought one thing that was really interesting is you did have that, and you relied on that a lot. And that was actually another thing that must have taken you a long time is for some of this stuff, you were digging into records that I didn't even know how you got, because there's stories before he starts selling these drugs that are really interesting as well. But one thing that I thought was fascinating is it's not just the dry transcript. You had access to the doctor himself. The doctor, and I want you to talk some about this, what this was like.
Tell us how.
He's talking to you. Yeah. How did you gain his trust to that level? And just
by the way, the book is now sympathetic to the doctor.
Right.
So.
Well, you're right. I did speak to him, but I don't want to pretend like it was any great journalistic achievement to get this guy to talk to me, because he's of a particular personality where I honestly think if anyone called him up in prison now or then, he's a guy who wants to get his story out. Sure, I don't think it hurt that when I first wrote him a letter shortly after I heard about his case, which was a full 2 years before his trial, and I explained that I was his old classmate's son, that maybe helped a little bit.
His best friend, I think. Didn't he describe your father as his best friend?
Like a lot of things, opinions differ on that. Paul refers to my dad as his former best friend. My dad says, no, I was never that close with him. So another reason why this took 15 years is because what Paul said, you have to fact check everything because the record or what other people said often differed. But yes, I did speak to Paul Volkman. You as prosecutors can perhaps explain to your listeners the wisdom of a defendant in a high-profile prosecution speaking at length to a graduate student journalist who has a tape recorder running before the trial. Is that something attorneys usually advise their
Never.
clients?
No.
But that's who we're dealing with. I don't think Paul ever told his defense attorneys he was going to speak to a journalist for hours and hours on record before his trial, but he did. Because I know that he felt he was innocent. He still does. From the first moment I met him to the last moment we spoke, over a period of 10 years, he didn't waver in that. He maintains he was a good doctor who was treating his patients, who was exercising good judgment and abiding by all laws and moral codes, so on and so forth. He believes he's wrongfully convicted. So I know that. And I think he probably believed that he could persuade me of his innocence and turn me into an asset of a kind who would then go and spread the gospel of this wrongfully, at that time, accused great guy. I think he thought there was no other lesson to take away from talking to him. As it turns out, I did take away a lot of things that were not that, and I tried my best to convey them in the book. But I also talk about his intelligence and his ability to, if not quite persuade, he has a forceful way of presenting his case. It's not entirely persuasive, but if you didn't go down 400 miles away to Southern Ohio and check up on a lot of the things he said, you might be inclined to believe it.
Well, he not only didn't convince you, he didn't convince the jury either, because he was ultimately convicted and he's serving, I think, the longest sentence of any pill mill prosecution. Is it 4 life sentences? Is that correct?
Consecutive.
I mean, there's
a lot of things that make this case stick out from the pack of doctors, many, many doctors convicted during this time period. One is his level of education. I didn't find very many doctors who had an MD, PhD. One is the fact of where the crimes took place. Portsmouth, Ohio has been called the epicenter of the prescription drug epidemic, or one of the hot spots. One was, as I said, the fact that he refused a plea deal, and therefore we have this remarkable historical record of this case being discussed at length in a courtroom. And then you have maybe the most, the fact that makes his case stand out the most, his extraordinarily long sentence of 4 consecutive life terms.
And even with that, I think this came out in trial, but they were able to link, 14 deaths to him and potentially more. I mean, this is huge, as we've said before, because you're not typically the one to hand over the drugs. He is actually the one to hand over the drugs in this instance, but obviously people usually don't take it right there and then overdose in front of you. And so to tie deaths to him is shocking. And I'm not a doctor, but if I knew that something I did set off a chain reaction that led to someone's death, I don't know if I could, handle that immense weight, having helped have someone meet their early demise. But Volkman is not like that. I think he says, not only does he think every single prescription is legitimate, I mean, those are hard things to look in the face of and still say, I did nothing wrong. I assume, those were some of the conversations that you had with him. How do you think someone who is very smart can basically look at the devastation that is viscerally in front of him, presented at an 8-week trial, and still kind of claim, I had no fault whatsoever?
Well, I stopped short of a diagnosis of him in the book. I didn't necessarily think it was appropriate for me to just stamp a label on him, nor did...
There are several that fit.
Yeah, partly I wanted to just leave it up to my readers to kind of... I think it's more powerful as a reader if, instead of just being told what is what, you're shown what's going on. So to answer your question, Alice, he is a guy who, not just in his criminal activity, throughout his life, and not even just in his practice of medicine, in his personal life as well, because I interviewed his kids in the book, does not really take any kind of accountability for his behavior. He has a way of portraying himself, really believing himself to be a victim, and thinking everyone else is an antagonist, is a corrupt person or an evil person or a stupid person. And he is the one who's really correct in the situation, whether that's a personal interaction with one of his family members, whether it's an earlier instance in his career where he was sued for malpractice, or in his criminal case. So when it comes to the deaths of his patients, of course, I was interested to hear, how do you account for this? What happened? And he had a few different explanations. Interestingly, as I point out in the book, these did not necessarily stay consistent over time. In an early letter he wrote shortly before his indictment in the proceedings involving the seizure of his assets, he says that the patients who died, he doesn't deny that they died or that they were his patients. He believes they were likely suicides. They were in chronic pain. So that was one explanation. But by the time
where'd the drugs to commit suicide with?
Well, by the time his case rolls around, the trial, from reading it, that isn't what they went with. They went with, these people all had other medical conditions, even though they were in their 30s and 40s, that caused their death, namely heart disease. And here I think they had somewhat of a point. There wasn't enough information, the lack of an autopsy, for instance, to definitively say what the person's cause of death was. I'm not saying I think that gets him off the hook entirely, but I was fascinated when experts called by the defense pointed that out.
Well, and I think we've seen that. I've seen that. I've handled an appeal. I can't remember if it was one of the cases that Alice prosecuted or someone else, where they had someone who had died, and it was the same thing, because you can always, these are so difficult, because if I sell you fentanyl on the street corner, or if I sell you ecstasy that turns out to have fentanyl on it and you have an overdose, that's easy. I'm a drug dealer. I gave you this obviously illegal drug. Yeah. But the doctors, it's so hard because the statute was not designed for doctors at all. Right. You get into this whole medically necessary, all that stuff. And then the people who tend to be their victims do tend to be people who have underlying issues. I mean, a lot of them are addicted to these drugs for a reason. It is not typical that just a completely healthy person walks off the street and says, hey, you know what I'd like to do? I would like to get addicted to Oxy. Can you sell me some? That's not how it goes. So you see those arguments a lot. And Alice was talking about one of her trials. She had me arrest all her witnesses because none of them showed up because they were all people who were addicts. So I had to go issue all these arrest warrants and have the marshals go out and haul these people into court so they could testify. So they are really difficult, which I think goes to how egregious his conduct was, because you see doctors get away with stuff like this all the time and get stiff sentences, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but not something like this. And I think it just, whether he can accept it or not, it's a testament to how serious his conduct was. And I want to talk a little bit about that acceptance, because I don't want to give the whole book away. But as I was saying earlier, how he got to what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. How does this guy go from Chicago to where he is? And I just feel like pride goeth before the fall. This is the ultimate example of that, because his pride and his almost God complex that got him into the situation where he's accepting, correct me if I'm wrong, a help wanted ad essentially from this woman and her daughter to come 400 miles away and be their pill mill doctor. Like, how does he get there?
A woman who, by the way, the owner of the clinic where he went to work, who had no medical background whatsoever, who had no college degree, who had worked in fast food restaurants and factories and didn't have any formal medical training. That's who Paul Volkmann, MD, PhD, went to work for in a cash-only pain clinic, and still turned around and maintains it was all legit, which tells you a bit about him. So the book that I wrote, me trying to make sense of a mountain of material, paperwork, interviews, 10 years of notes, I wound up splitting it up into 5 chronological sections. And in the first section of the book, which is called Malpractice, I tell the story of Paul Volkmann's life up until the point that his alleged criminal activity starts. And by the time he crossed the line into criminal activity, he's a grown man. He's in his 50s. He's had a full medical career, or a long medical career. He has grown kids. So this wasn't a youthful indiscretion, right? And so I set out to the book is a biography in a sense of this guy. And he had an odd medical career, you could say. He and my dad weren't really trained to be doctors who saw patients. They were really trained to be medical researchers who spent the bulk of their time in labs, writing up study results for publication. And they were trained to be in an academic setting. That was the MD, PhD part.
What disease was it that he cured? He
claims to cure. I don't think he cured anything. You're talking about, he said that he had found during his career as a researcher, a brilliant new treatment for a certain kind of stroke. But according to him, this research took place while his lab director was out of town, when Volkmann wrote up the results of his experiment or his study, which he was sure, he told me years later, was going to, change the field, a paradigm shift in treating stroke. His lab director refused to sign off on this brilliant research, and that soured him on research, and he left research afterward. Well, I tracked down the lab director, who didn't remember any of the kind of brilliant, game-changing research Paul described. He said literally, this was a guy who kind of blended in with a wallpaper. He was an extraordinary researcher. He remembered that Paul was pretty busy because he worked a lot in his off hours, moonlighting in emergency rooms, which certainly checks out with what I know about Paul. So Paul has a brief career as a researcher, flames out for reasons that he says are one thing, other people say are another. Throughout the book, this is a theme where I'm saying what Paul says happens, often a self-glorifying narrative where he is brilliant, courageous, ethical, and other people are corrupt, stupid, etc. After this stint in research, he goes into pediatrics, which doesn't really make sense for a lot of reasons, but it's what he chose. He says it's because he liked kids. And I found some people who said he was a pretty good pediatrician. He set up an office in Chicago, but he finds out pretty early on he's not making the kind of money he wants to make to support his wife and kids. He has a family at this point. So he starts moonlighting in local emergency rooms on nights and weekends. Over time, he finds that he can make even more money taking temporary jobs at emergency rooms across the Midwest. He works at dozens of emergency rooms. He gets medical licenses in 6 states, doing what are called locum tenens jobs, which is basically temp work for doctors, days, weeks at a time, often in small towns in Wisconsin and Ohio and Indiana. And so he is a pediatrician. He remains a pediatrician for a while, but he's making a lot of his money as a kind of traveling emergency room doctor. Because this is a legal podcast, I'll also mention he made some, I think, pretty hefty pocket change as an expert witness in malpractice cases as well.
Which, when I read that part, I was like, how did the other side never attack him for all of the stuff, like the killing people and the all of his malpractice? I never understood how he could maintain his expert testimony without being crossed on that.
It's a good question. So what happens over the course of about 20 years is he faces a number of malpractice lawsuits. A couple of these stem from incidents that happened in his pediatrics practice, including what's the most tragic case of a young girl who was about a year old who winds up dying for reasons that a civil jury determines are basically Paul's fault. And that's a story I get into in the book. Other people, there's a pretty serious injuries who Paul sees in emergency rooms and apparently doesn't give treatment that's up to the standards of care. And in fact, according to these lawsuits, causes these people quite a bit of harm. One was a brain bleed that he hadn't caught in time. The guy had brain damage. Another, a woman wound up losing her arm below her elbow. And another one, an elderly woman with a feeding tube in her stomach, had some pretty severe medical complications. So in all of these malpractice cases, Volkman claims he was screwed over. Predatory lawyers looking for a quick payout came after him, and either, the jury was in the tank against him, or his insurers settled cases that they shouldn't have settled. In all of them, he's able to, much like he would later on, write them off as not my fault, other people out to get me.
The story that was most striking to me was one that didn't actually result in anything going wrong or anything going bad, where he wanted to inject epinephrine into the heart of the girl who had she was having like an allergic reaction or something, or like a minor asthma.
I think it was an asthma attack.
It was asthma. And the nurses conspired to basically grab the girl and get her out of the hospital so that he couldn't do that. I mean, that was just
chilling.
I don't understand how that can happen and someone keeps their license. And there were several indictments of the licensing boards in these states throughout your book, but that one was one that just...
Well, I mean, I got a lot of the answers in the story I was looking for, but even after years of working and a lot of legwork, there are still some questions I have that remain unanswered. One of them is, after the incident where the 1-year-old child died in the late 80s in Chicago in his pediatrics practice, the Illinois Medical Board came after his license. There was a formal complaint, and they were looking to either suspend or revoke it. And the charges were serious. Of course, a child died. And somehow, and this is the part I don't know, he fought that off. And this story might be different. I couldn't get the minutes or the transcript of the proceedings to see what happened exactly. But he kept going as a doctor. And I don't know how this would have been different.
And that's such a interesting way to look at this, right? This is why I think your book is so important, because while these practices do continue, they will continue to be prosecuted. But what you show in the story is there's so many steps along the way. It didn't need to get to where it was. But as so many of us know, we know the effect of watching someone get beat up on the street and passerbys walk by, something like that. This is akin to that, in that worse and worse things continue to happen. And you see all these off ramps, but the off ramps are never taken. And it's even harder to take it against someone who has the seeming, glowing credentials of someone like Volkman. But what I think is really interesting about your book, it's wonderfully told. It's a deep dive into how this man can fall to the depths of serving one of the longest sentences ever doled out to someone in his position. The devastation that he did, unlike a lot of the criminals that we prosecute and were able to successfully take off the streets, the effects of what he's done continues to this day. We know that addiction is something that you don't just stop taking the drug, right? Especially the types of narcotics he was prescribing. It changes your brain chemistry forever. It's not impossible at all to come clean, but it is incredibly difficult. And many
Yeah.
don't make it out of that cycle of addiction. And we still live in the world that he helped fuel, which is very, very devastating and humbling to look at, which is why this isn't just a historical look at a bad doctor and a fascinating legal case. It is also an insight into how we got to where we are today. I mean, that's just my plug for people to go read this book. I think you do such a good job of trying to dissect the genesis for him and how he becomes part of the problem we continue to see today.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. We're in the midst of this awful fentanyl epidemic right now. And if you go to the CDC's website and you look at the charts tracking opiate-related deaths over the last 20 some odd years, one graph shows they identify 3 waves of opiate-related deaths. The first wave is from the mid-1990s when OxyContin is released up to about 2010, and that's prescription drug-fueled deaths. That was the main cause of deaths up to that point. When there was a successful kind of crackdown on the flow of prescription drugs, epidemic switched over to heroin, where a lot of people went. They, as you say, were addicted at this point. And with the supply cutoff went to the street drug of heroin. Heroin ultimately gave way to fentanyl, which we're still dealing with. And if you look at those years, this case, and I point this out when I give book talks, falls squarely within that first wave. And it is by no means the only doctor. There were a lot of doctors, as I've said, but it's a representative case. It tells the story of one doctor who kind of broke bad in one clinic and an era when there were a lot of clinics like this. And so in some ways, it is a kind of prequel for how we as a country, I'm in Rhode Island, which hasn't been spared by any means from the opiate epidemic. Neither is Alabama. Neither is anywhere in this country. This story, I wanted it to show a little bit of how we got here.
Let me just say, one of the best parts of your book is the very end, when you spend some time on the people behind the story, the people who lost their lives, who they were. They weren't just addicts. They were real people with people who loved them and lives and everything else. And I thought that was just a great addition and a great way to bring the whole story full circle.
Thank you. I mean, I really, I have mixed feelings. I know this is a true crime podcast and I'm a true crime author, but I think it's a genre that is best approached with a lot of caution, because if you just zoom into, the very nature of true crime is that it's real people. These events really happen. In this case, not so long ago, where certainly there's still people living who know these people. That to me was an extraordinarily high responsibility to tell that story. Again, here we're back to why this took 15 years. I really didn't want to mess it up. I saw this as one of the biggest responsibilities you can have as a journalist, is telling the story of a victim of a crime who isn't around to tell their own story, and under circumstances where, unfortunately, addiction is unfairly stigmatized. So I didn't want to fall into some of the, worst tropes of writing about addiction or writing about Appalachia, the area where this all took place. I was an outsider. I also didn't want to do wrong by this community, because they've certainly had their fair share of kind of cheap shots thrown at them from journalists from elsewhere. So I really wanted to approach it slowly and carefully. And as you said, Brett, not just have these people be portrayed as their worst moments, but to show that these were people who had full lives, who had careers, who had loved ones, who had hobbies, who had distinct personalities. And yeah, I did go to their burial sites, and I wanted to convey what that was like. So I included a bit about that as well in that final chapter.
Thank you for doing all the work for 15 years in order to bring us this story. And Prescription for Pain, I think you can buy it anywhere that sells books. Is that correct?
You can, and there will be a paperback coming out on April 1st. But yeah, indie bookstores, online, everywhere. You can get the hardcover. In a couple months, you'll be able to get the paperback. And thank you so much for having me on, guys.
Philip, thank you so much. Truly, thank you for the work that you did here and for telling it in such a responsible and compassionate manner while bringing all the facts as well.
I got to ask you before I go, did I get all my legal jargon and facts right?
You're
Like
awesome.
No.
Yeah, you are awesome. Yeah, no, you speak the lingo perfectly with all the
Well,
CSA.
thank you, because I also didn't want to write a book. My mom's a lawyer, my dad's a doctor. It's maybe not too big of a stretch to see why I wrote a medical crime story, but I didn't want a lawyer to pick this up and be like, "This is total nonsense."
No,
You did a great job. And don't stop.
Incredibly.
I mean, when I first started reading the book, I was like, well, I don't know. How good is this going to be? It's about drugs, opioids.
Right.
But I was hooked. I mean, I guess that's a bad word to use, but I was really into it. I really enjoyed it. And I think everybody who listens to it is going to enjoy it as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Philip. Well, we've taken up an hour of your time, and we try to be respectful of your time because you need to go write another amazing book like this. No pressure. But all of you, you've heard him here. Philip Isle has an incredible story to tell. You can get the book now, Prescription for Pain. Get it wherever you buy books. And if you're a paperback kind of person, get the hard copy now. Get the paperback April 1st as well. And we are so thankful for you coming on to share your perspective. Before we sign off, though, Brett, is there anything else you'd like to ask Philip?
I just want to note there is also an audiobook. I don't know if you read the audiobook or someone else.
I didn't read it. No, somebody else.
Okay.
There is an audiobook, yes.
So if you want to listen to your books.
Yes. If you've got a 17-hour drive in your future, this will take you there.
When you get tired of listening to us.
That's right. Well, Philip, thank you for what you do, and thank you for bringing us this incredible story. And all of you guys, let us know what you think. We'll pass on all of your praise to Philip. I know he's way more interesting than us, and we are just glad that he graced us with his presence. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs.
There was a whole. I got super interested in the FOIA, but
That's awesome. That's look, FOIA. We always say access to information is where the real information, like real story, is.
Yeah.
FOIA is where information goes to die.
That's true. It's not
It's where
freedom.
sunshine fades into darkness.
Well, I will come knocking maybe in 15 years from now.
There you go.
when I have the
No,
You gotta speed
I
up our
hear the next
production
one.
schedule.
The next one you'll get done in 12 years.
There you go.
I hope so. But thank you so much.
No, thank you. I know you're an hour later than us, so thank you so much.
That's fine. Thank you.
And
I'm going to go ahead and end this.
Pluto TV has all the shows and movies you love streaming for free. That means laughter is free with gut-busting comedies like The Neighborhood, Boomerang, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Bueller.
Mystery is free with countless cases to crack from Criminal Minds, Tracker, and Matlock.
I'm a lawyer, like the old TV show.
And thrills are free with heart-pumping hits like The Walking Dead and Pulp Fiction.
Correctamundo.
Feel the free Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.